area, and I have worked a lot on sidewalk landscapes, which is what inspired this talk. So the Hellstrip is most often defined as the strip between the curb and the sidewalk in an urban or suburban area. There can be other examples, like maybe a median or an island in a parking lot. Those could be examples of Hellstrips also. So I'm trying to keep the talk as general as possible because I know you guys all come from different places and that people on the internet are going to be watching from different locations. So I'm trying to give advice that is generally applicable, but it is based on. So some of the characteristics of a Hellstrip is, you know, it's public, right? And it's typically in an urban or suburban area. Rural areas, you know, they have what they have. But what are some of the issues that we might have with a publicly accessible garden?
Accessibility for cars and people coming out of passenger side.
That's right. That's right. So if someone's getting out of their car, what are they going to step on? A plant, a wobbly rock, or are they going to be able to put their foot down on something solid? Yes, absolutely.
Liability.
Possibly liability. Yeah. What about some negative impacts to the garden itself?
Well, there's not a lot of soil.
There's, limited space. Absolutely. Yeah, so dogs are a big issue. People's human feet are an issue, and theft, quite frankly. I live in San Francisco, and there are a lot of things we don't have. We don't have extreme heat. We don't have extreme cold or frost or snow. But we do have all the same problems of any urban or suburban area in that we have dogs, we have people who want to steal plants, and we have careless people on their phone who might walk through a garden if they aren't paying attention. And yes, we have people to consider that we don't want our garden to be harmful to humans. So things like thorns or things that are so overgrown that you can't see down the street, those are plants that we want to avoid. Another characteristic of a Hellstrip would be water, ? Yes, maybe, occasionally, or not at all, right? So that's something that we'll talk more about, but has to be solved before we put in even one single plant. And then, of course, limited space. So those are kind of the general things with Hellstrip. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, as you know, we have a dry season and a wet season. And that's the same in San Francisco, even though we don't have a hot summer, we have a dry summer. And definitely with all the pavement that reflects sun, it can get pretty darn hot. There's essentially 3 problems that we need to solve if we are going to design a Hellstrip. I mean, okay, why would we want a Hellstrip given all these problems? Let's backtrack to that. Why are you guys here?
Curb appeal.
Curb appeal, absolutely. Aesthetic beauty. Anything else?
Pollinators.
Yeah, we want to support pollinators in every little pocket we possibly can. Yes. Yes?
Make it pretty, people will leave less garbage in it.
Yep.
Yes, that's a good point. So yeah, I didn't mention trash, but trash is a thing. Sometimes that works. There's the broken window theory. If a window is broken and you leave it, then it makes people think like you don't care, the neighbors don't care, and then kind of spirals to that. So we do want to plant, and it's good for our soul, and it's good for it's a public garden. It's good for everybody who walks by, people you don't even know, or your closest friends and neighbors. You know, you're lifting up everybody's soul and heart, assuming we can solve these problems and do it right. And the 3 main problems are going to be access, we'll elaborate in a minute, water, and third is plants. And so we kind of want to go through these in that order. We don't want to start buying plants and putting them in if we haven't solved these problems. So when we say access, we mean, can you as the gardener or whoever is going to maintain the garden, can you access every part of the garden, right? Is your Hellstrip jammed up against a building? Then don't make it too wide because you need to be able to reach across. Or you need to put maybe a decorative stepping stone or two in there so that you can step in there and do the work, or someone can do the work. Access around the garden by the public. So being able to step off out of your car onto the curb. So in San Francisco, there's a permit for sidewalk landscapes. And that little area, when you step out of your car next to the curb, is called the courtesy strip. So I'm going to use that term in San Francisco, which I encourage you to take a look at the permit information. I have handouts that I'm going to give at the end. The 24 inches wide, including the curb, which is 6 inches wide. So what that means is 18 inches of stable space. Now, some people choose to, when they cut the concrete, just leave 18 inches of concrete there. Some people choose to take out concrete and put down stable, porous pavers. I think the city does allow decomposed granite, or DG. You guys familiar with that? It's also known as path fines. And it's this, what Annie's has got here is a little bit coarser. Path fines are more like either very coarse sand or very fine gravel. So it's essentially rock that is crushed to the point where you can compact it kind of by hand or by foot pretty easily. It's forgiving in that if you have a low spot, you can add a little bit more. If you have a high spot, you can scrape a little bit away. So for a homeowner installation, it can be a lot easier than trying to get pavers set perfectly, right? And not wobbly. So I do encourage that wherever you live, you check with your own municipal government to see if there are restrictions or requirements about gardening in the public space. But if there aren't, I do recommend that you design a courtesy strip in. Yes?
You mentioned this 24 inches into the Hellstrip for people to step onto.
Yes.
Is there guidance on how frequently that should be based on lengths of cars?
So the courtesy strip has to be for the whole garden frontage.
Oh.
Yes. So I'm going to draw a picture so that we all get a good idea about that. So here's the sidewalk. Okay. Here's the curb. Here's the Hellstrip. So 18 inches in for the entire garden has to be the courtesy strip.
From the concrete part below that area that you're showing.
Yeah, so here's the sidewalk, here's the garden,
Right.
okay? And here is the courtesy strip. So when you park your car, it doesn't matter where you step. You will step onto a stable surface.
Okay, but you know, but there's usually like at least at my house, there's this concrete strip.
Uh-huh.
That's probably what, about 8 inches wide, and then
She's talking about the curb.
the curb. Thank you. That is
Yeah,
exactly
the
right.
curb is 6 inches wide, and that's considered part of the courtesy
Okay.
strip. So they say they want a 24-inch wide courtesy strip, including the curb.
Perfect.
So that's part of it. Although some people's curbs are a little bit more uneven. So this is where you step, okay? The other thing we need to have is a path of travel between the sidewalk and the curb, at least every like 20 feet or so. And this path of travel has to be at least 4 feet. Okay, so what that means is somebody can get out of their car, and not too far away is going to be a way to get through that garden that's plant-free and stable. So again, that could be concrete that you leave behind. That could be decorative pavers that are very stably placed, or it could be decomposed granite if your city or town or county allows for that. But you know, again, it's just to help people, get through that garden, so that they don't have like a big wall of plants. How many people have parked on the street next to like a giant hedge
Oh yeah.
that goes on for the whole block? I have, and the other day, like I rolled up my window and I caught a piece of the plant, and and drove away with it. It's like, so that's not what a hell strip should be planted with. So we've got the courtesy strip, and then we've got the accessible path of travel. And we do need to consider the width of our sidewalk too. So in San Francisco, they kind of want a minimum of 6 feet for that. You know, Americans with Disability Act says minimum of 4 foot safe path of travel, which is why these are 4 feet. So you just have to kind of think, you know, be smart, because if you only leave 4 feet, that's really tight for 2 people to pass. And even 6 feet, I have watched like somebody with a stroller coming one way and maybe somebody with a cane or a dog coming the other way. It's difficult for them to pass. And what we have is, they call it a pinch point. And when you have a pinch point, you know, people can run into each other. So just think carefully about, you know, how much concrete you take away. Of course, we want to take away all the concrete. You know, in our dreams, we just want to live in a beautiful, wild garden. But the reality is, you know, we have to work around people. Yes?
Paths of travel?
Yes.
How many of those do you need? What distance do you need?
I believe it's every 20 feet. So when I give you your handout, you can, I've given you the link to the City of San Francisco, where you can take a look at the permit requirements. And again, your municipality may have their own requirements, or they may have no requirements. So, or they may have bans or restrictions on planting at all. So I do encourage that you check with your own municipality, okay?
And who owns this? Because I get this confused message about who's responsible if there's injury.
Yeah. So it is confusing, and many municipalities do send mixed messages about street trees. You know, the street tree is in the public right of way, but the city doesn't maintain it. The property owner has to maintain it, unless it's on this street, or, you know, something. And San Francisco has been, you know, back and forth since I've lived there, where it's all the city, it's all the property owner, or it's sort of, yeah, the city does it, but in their own schedule. So it is very, very confusing. And that is why they developed a permit process. There was, so the origin of this is there was no permit process. And if you planted a tree, you got a square, 3 feet by 3 feet, maybe 4 by 4 if you were lucky, and that's it. And if you wanted a rectangle, they didn't know what to do. They didn't, you know. So people would like cluster a bunch of pots together on the sidewalk to make it look like a garden, all kinds of things that were problematic. And then we had a big storm in, I think, 2002, flooding, cars floating in the street. And a local landscape architect named Jane Martin was living on one of those streets that is built on top of a creek, Shotwell Street. And she said, you know, why do we have all this pavement? Why can we not have porous pavement or open pavement with plants that can absorb some of this stormwater? And so she's a landscape architect. She's used to working with permit processes, and she worked with the city and county of San Francisco to develop a permit process so that they would feel comfortable about people doing this. So it is on the property owner to apply for the permit and to maintain it. There are nonprofit programs such as Friends of the Urban Forest, which can help with the process, especially if 3 or more neighbors on a block band together and do it. And it can look really nice when that happens. And then they will provide some funding and some supplies and some labor to make it happen. But ultimately, yes, you do have to consider, how are you going to take care of it? Yes?
I think the corollary to that in Richmond is urban till.
Urban till?
I think they'll help you coordinate whatever you want to do with this yard.
Okay, with sidewalk gardens?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. I don't know. They're a really good resource.
Right. Yeah.
They'll certainly be able to help you with next steps.
Okay, great. And so that story leads me to the next thing, which is, don't forget that one of the main things that these sidewalk gardens can do is collect stormwater, right? So what that means is we do, and the city actually says, we do want the level of the soil to actually be 1 inch below the sidewalk grade and fill in the rest with mulch. And the reason for that is, you know, if you build a big raised bed, water falls in the raised bed, but then stormwater flowing is going to flow around and just keep going down the hill. So you can have porous fencing, like wrought iron fencing. I use wrought iron fencing a lot in my sidewalk gardens. It's very hard to break. Even if a truck runs over it, it'll bend, but then you might be able to bend it back into shape. Whereas some of this cheap wire stuff, it doesn't really deter anything, and it's easy to get messed up and turn into trash. So porous fencing, something that water can flow through, the city and county will approve that. They don't want to see raised beds. So, and for good reason. That being said, I understand the temptation for raised beds because it gets maybe a little bit of the foot traffic and the dog foot traffic out of the equation. But you know, then you lose that really, really valuable stormwater collection. So,
But again, is it legal to block that to public access? To block the Hellstrip from public access?
I think it is. Yeah, it is. You can put something around it. I mean, do check with your own municipality. But, you know, the whole point is that you're providing a benefit for the public to look at, and you're not obstructing the path of travel on the sidewalk. Okay, now sometimes if you're lucky and you have a little bit of room, let's say here's your building or house, right? And you have a little bit of room here, maybe you can do another garden here. And the beauty of this is you don't need to have a courtesy strip or a path of travel here, because obviously, you know, if this is the door, you're not going to block the door of your building. So you have a little more freedom there, but you might be dealing with more of a shade situation if it's right up against the building. So you might not be able to put in the same kind of plants. Questions? Okay. I'm sorry? Yes.
Can you elaborate where the fence would go?
So what I do is I put like a wrought iron fence around the entire border of the garden, and it's a decorative fence. I buy it from Plow and Hearth. You can just look up decorative wrought iron fencing. It's 18 inches high, and it just, the panels kind of click together. There's a loop and a stick, and you just can hammer them in with like a rubber mallet. So they're really easy to install and go around corners. And like I said, you know, they'll last forever unless somebody runs over one with a vehicle. Pretty much is the only way to destroy those.
I always worry about the liability again. What happens if somebody trips over it?
Yeah, I mean,
the risks you take.
yeah, I haven't had that experience because I, you know, put in sidewalk gardens. I've never seen anybody trip. But it's certainly a concern. But then again, you know, lifted sidewalk flags that are lifted because we had an earthquake or the soil settled or a tree root lifted it up, people can trip over that too. So in fact, before the city started maintaining the sidewalk around trees, and it was on the private homeowner to do that, if you got a sidewalk landscape permit, you could extend your sidewalk repair citation. So like if you were cited, like your sidewalk is lifting, you have 30 days or 60 days to fix it. But if you applied for a sidewalk landscape permit, they would give you like 6 months because they knew the permit needed to be processed. And the beauty is with a sidewalk garden, you're taking away some of that concrete that was lifted anyway. So you're kind of, you know, taking away a future problem. Yeah, people can trip, absolutely. They can trip over anything. And you certainly, if you are concerned, may want to consult your attorney or that sort of thing. But there are sidewalk landscapes all over San Francisco and all over the world. And, you know, I think they provide more benefits than detriments if they're done right. Okay, let's talk about water. And again, I do have a handout that I can give you. So there's kind of 3 categories. Yes, there is water available. Sometimes, meaning with effort, you know, you could bring a hose from a faraway place, around the corner, the back of the building, through the house, whatever. But you could do it, like just to get plants established maybe for the first year or so. And then like, heck no. There's just no possible way any water can be brought to the site. So that is going to inform your plant choices, or as well as your plant timing, right? In the San Francisco Bay Area, you know that you're not going to plant in the middle of the dry season, right? We're not, unless you are in the yes or sometimes water category, or it's San Francisco and you're planting in the shade. You can get away with it. So if you're in the heck no category, then you're just taking notes right now. You're not planting today, which is good because you should take time to think about it anyway. So if you're lucky enough that yes, water is available, there is a hose bib either like right in the front of the building or like just inside the garage door on the other side, and water can be brought, then you're very lucky. If it's sometimes, you can still do this, and I would recommend either case drip irrigation, not lawn sprinklers. If you have lawn sprinklers, like there's already a lawn there and you want to convert, lawn sprinklers can be converted to drip irrigation. Okay, what are some of the advantages of drip irrigation?
Continuous watering.
I'm sorry?
Continuous watering.
Yeah, so it waters over a wide area, and it can be also timed. And so instead of like putting your hose on a slow drip somewhere and walking away and 20 minutes later taking it and moving it, right? You can water a wide area continuously at once. Yeah. Any other? Yes. No overspray. No overspray. Yeah. So unless you're on a slope, then you may have to think about runoff. But yeah, the drip emitters are measured in gallons per hour. So an average drip emitter is 0.5 to 0.6 gallons per hour. Lawn sprinklers output are measured in gallons per minute. That's a lot different. Yes. Anyone else?
If it's in the soil or just under the soil, there's no evaporation either. So you get every drop of water that you get.
Yes. Yes. Again, as long as you don't have runoff. I don't recommend burying the drip irrigation. I recommend putting it on the soil surface and covering it with mulch. And that is because invariably you will need to make changes or repairs. And you do not want to be digging. If you have a leak, you don't want to dig a giant muddy hole. So I put mine right on the surface and I cover it with mulch and you never see it. So drip irrigation can be installed with a very simple hose end, battery powered or solar powered timer. And you can program it, set it, and not forget it, because we do want to check our programs and adjust them seasonally. But suppose you have a hose bib inside the garage and you don't want to drill a hole to bring water out. You don't want a timer exposed to the public. You don't want a hose bib exposed to the public. Can you connect your hose directly to a drip irrigation tubing? Yes. And I never really thought about this, but I helped a homeowner put in a sidewalk landscape, and this is what they had. They had essentially, one strip by the building, one strip by the curb, and they had a hose bib inside the sidewalk, inside the garage. And they're like, well, couldn't we just connect the hose to the drip tubing and then we don't have to drill through the wall? And I said, well, I think so. And so what I found is, yeah, I'll pass this around. Essentially, there's an adapter with a filter and pressure regulator that can connect to drip tubing, and it has a threaded end. I added my own, I added one component, which is an on-off switch, brass ring with an on-off switch, because this adapter now lives on the soil forever, and I wanted to close it off so it wouldn't get dirt in it when somebody was using it. So I'm going to pass this around. When I put in my drip irrigation, now these days, because I took a class in irrigation from Lori Palmquist, who is the guru around here, and I use only 1/2-inch emitter line now. I don't use any spaghetti tubing. Any of that, those connections are so squirrely. I use 1/2-inch emitter line with the emitters spaced every 12 inches. And I essentially make like a grid. So if this is my garden, it's a Hellstrip, you know, here's my adapter, and then I make a grid like this. And there's a emitter, like that. And then I put in my plants. So I don't worry about having to connect a 1/4-inch spaghetti tubing individually for every plant. I know that my whole garden is getting watered, and as the roots of my plants extend, they're going to find water. It's so much simpler, and it uses far fewer connections, and it fails less because those things don't pull out. Yes?
What size tubing did you say you always use now?
1/2 inch. Yeah, so the blue connectors, yes?
You're blowing my mind right now. I'm wondering though, like I've heard of a similar system, but it wasn't a 1/4 inch. But I don't see the water really spreading. Like when I try to do this, it like just like goes exactly where little drops are, and it doesn't seem to like
To spread, yeah. So
is that the soil conditions that's making that happen?
it is. It's the soil texture. So soil texture has to do with the amount of sand, silt, and clay particles that are in the soil. So a coarse soil texture has more sand. A fine soil texture has more clay. So typically in a coarse textured soil, the water doesn't spread so much. It spreads more in a fine textured soil. So, you know, if you needed to, you could punch in a tiny little button emitter in between if you needed to. How tightly are you going to plant anyway? You know, I typically, you know, I'm jumping ahead to plants, but I typically plant like one plant per every 1 to 3 square feet of plantable space. So if I have 100 square feet and I have a lot of money and I want to plant tight because I'm afraid some of those plants won't make it, then I might put in 100 plants. But I might also put in, you know, 50 plants, or I might put in 33 plants. But I wouldn't put less than 33. So one every, you know, an emitter every 12 inches is pretty good, you know. And then this spacing too can depending on if it's flat or sloped or that sort of thing. Yes?
So I just want to ask you a question about what it is I'm looking at. Did you cut through the concrete so that you could get this under the door of the garage?
No, but what I did do is the concrete guy was able to shove, I made a PVC sleeve and I put drip tubing in there that didn't have any emitters inside it, and I measured, and so he was able to shove my drip under the sidewalk. So
But I'm still trying to figure out how you got it out of the garage without having to poke a hole in the garage or the wall.
they open their garage, they bring their hose out, they screw it into the adapter, they turn on the hose, they set a timer.
Okay.
So it's
So
that's
so
the
you have to manually hook
you
it up.
have
How
to
do you want it?
manually hook it up. So if you're in the sometimes category, like, all right, I can bring a hose like from around the corner or through the house or something, that could still work with that kind of system, and that could get you kind of into the establishment period. It could get you through a drought period. So it's still maybe worth laying this out and putting an adapter in and just letting it lay. So I will say that this adapter, long term, I'm not sure how long they last. I bought my client an extra one, They do sort of go directly to the tubing, so they're not removable. You kind of have to leave them there. So I recommended that they go under the adapter to keep it kind of out of the soil and flat. And again, I added that little brass ring with the on-off switch. And I said, just turn that off, just to keep grit or whatever from, or spiders, you know, from getting in there. Yes.
You sure again your space on plants is 1 every 3 square feet.
Minimum either every 1 square foot or every 3 square feet, but not, or every 2 square feet or every 1.5 square feet. But you know what I mean? Like that's kind of the range. So we'll talk about plants in a minute, but so if you're yes or sometimes, I really recommend that you put together this drip grid that would be covered with mulch and either is hooked up to a hose end timer that does the work for you or a drip to hose adapter for manual watering. If you're in the heck no category, what are some strategies we can do to help to establish a garden that we already know? You put in the right plants for sure, yes. But when do you put them in? You put them in the fall. And when people say the fall, in my mind, because our rainy season sometimes isn't reliable, I usually say between Halloween and Christmas. That's probably because if the rainy season is gonna start late, it usually is gonna at least start between those times. You could try earlier, but we can get some really super hot days in September and October, which is technically the fall. So if you're in the heck no, like even to plant is gonna be problematic to water on planting day, like where you literally are gonna have to carry buckets or drive up with a water tank or something really crazy that you cannot repeat reliably, then I would say, yeah, you plant super drought tolerant plants during the rainy season, at the beginning of the rainy season, and you plant small specimens. And that is, of course, the beauty of Annie's because they sell 4-inch plants. So I wouldn't put in very much bigger than a 4-inch plant. In fact, if there's seeds that you can just throw a few compost balls of seeds down, that might even be something to do along with some 4-inch plants. So if you're in the heck no category, you've got to be very careful what you choose. You've got to be very careful when you plant. You've got to plant the smallest plant possible, and you've got to really keep an eye on things. You know, yes.
You just said compost seed ball. Are you actually saying make a bowl of compost with seeds in it?
Yes, or they sell them.
Okay.
They're called seed bombs. You know, like you could throw them over the fence and colonize a vacant lot with wildflowers.
Oh.
So, but you could make it yourself too. You could broadcast seed with compost, but how do you keep it from blowing away if you don't water it in? So if you're in the heck no category, you may be actually watching the weather and planting on a rainy day in the rain, which is, you know, poses its own problems. But if that's really the case and you want to do a Hellstrip, then you're going to have to be creative. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Before you move into plants,
Yes.
what do you do about the soil and turning it over and weed barrier and in preparation and hauling to make sure that there's no gas lines?
Yes, so very important. You call 811 to have your utilities marked. And if you're not planting a tree, probably you're going to be okay. In the city and county of San Francisco, if you have a utility box, you're supposed to maintain 6 inches free around that. So decomposed granite can be a good surface for that, or pavers. And that could help be one of your stepping stones to get into the garden and do maintenance.
But be mindful, because even if you're planting, I have a neighbor that was digging for planting, and somebody from one of the inspectors happened to be driving by and said, stop, you can't do this until you
call 811. Yeah, so do call. You want to know where the things are. Call 811, tell them what you're doing, when you're doing it, all of that stuff. Yes. In terms of turning over soil, Soil that has been under concrete is compacted. So whenever somebody builds pavement, the first thing they do is scrape off all the beautiful soil, and they put half of it back and compact the crap out of it. It has no oxygen. And then they also put some gravel. So you may, once that concrete is cut, you may have a lot of shards of debris to get rid of. And then, the soil might be very, very difficult to dig. I would be cautious about rototilling or turning soil if there's an existing tree, because that tree has already established a fine network of roots and keeping itself alive. And when we start rototilling or digging or doing a lot of damage, we can kill those fine feeder roots, which keep the tree alive. And that tree may be shading your plants and keeping the water from evaporating so quickly. So we don't want to go too crazy with soil prep. Obviously, if you can't even dig a hole, you're gonna need to do some chopping. But I like to use compost as a top dressing under the mulch instead of having to rototill it in. So it's going to depend on your soil type. If you have compacted clay, you're probably going to have to do some rototilling. But if you have a compacted clay and a tree, and the tree is doing well, or even, if it's doing badly, then you definitely are going to want to be a little bit careful about how much destruction you do. The establishment of drip irrigation will eventually help the tree regrow roots that are disturbed. But if you just do a wholesale rototilling of all of its roots, it's going to be hard. Yes?
Hey, so we have a big problem around here of people parking on the Hellstrip. And so when I moved in, it was like tire marks that I had to till and like re-level.
Ooh, boy.
And I'm pretty sure a lot of motor oil and like transmission fluid has seeped into the soil because everything I've tried to plant there has just died. So how do I repair the soil if I'm like dealing with like potentially motor oil?
Do you have any weeds growing there?
Lots of weeds. Weeds and grass are pretty happy, but everything else dies. Anything I spend money on does.
Okay, it might be worth identifying what weeds are growing there. And there are plants out there that are sort of borderline weed but desirable. You may be cultivating things that are already used to that. Yeah. Compost over time can help make a healthier soil environment and can help chemicals and such be leached out. I certainly wouldn't recommend any edible plants. Yes.
Do you know any cover crops that might help pull the toxins out of the soil?
I don't know of any reliable science. There's people out there who do some bioremediation, but I would do research about it. Yeah.
Can you differentiate between, because you talk a lot about like if it's concrete and you're going to break up the concrete to make a plant, but in my case, for instance, there's no concrete.
Yeah.
But it's been we've covered it. We had originally covered it with weed barrier. So when you undo that, should you turn it over and put more compost into it, or?
So I would say. Yeah, she's asking about if the concrete has already been removed. So if the concrete's already been removed, then that soil's got some life in it. Although the weed barrier did sort of damage that a little bit. So I would recommend no weed barrier, no cloth, none of that stuff. If there's a bunch of existing weeds, you can use sheet mulching cardboard. So sheet mulch is a way of excluding light to existing weeds, and then you sort of plant or put pavers or decomposed granite on top of that. And the sheet mulch cardboard is designed to break down. This is why I say you should buy sheet mulching cardboard and not recycled boxes, because recycled boxes have a lot of waxes and dyes in them. They may not break down, and they may do the same thing that landscape cloth does, which is exclude water and air exchange from the soil. So, yes.
So a neighbor of mine said she was going to use newspaper. Does that work?
Use sheet mulching cardboard. Sheet mulching cardboard comes on a roll. It's recycled cardboard. It's super flimsy. It's almost like paper. It's like that kind of craft paper almost. You put down 2 layers of it, and then about 4 inches of compost on top. and your irrigation, and then you plant your small plants in the compost, and then you mulch. You kind of have to do it all at once, because if you put down the cardboard and then call it a day, the cardboard blows away. If you put down the cardboard and the compost and call it a day, the compost and cardboard blows away. So you kind of have to plan, like, today I am going to do the sheet mulching. So what you might do is say, well, I'm going to just do this half in completion, and then I'll do this half completely, so that instead of doing the whole thing part way, so that you don't have cardboard and compost blowing around and making your neighbors crazy.
Where do you buy it?
I get mine at the Urban Farmer store, and there is one in the Richmond Annex here. I'm sure it's available elsewhere, but I don't recommend using the boxes with the newspaper. I just recommend the sheet mulching cardboard. What that does is exclude light to any weeds and gives the desirable plants a chance to establish and outrun the weeds. Eventually weeds may pop up. But it's great if you already don't have concrete covering your soil had a chance to breathe and to get critters in it and to get some life. So it's going to be better off than the soil that was under concrete.
So you don't need to turn it over, break up the soil first, because
you could if it was a heavy clay, but I would be careful if there's existing trees, because you're damaging the tree from that. So see what you think. But yeah, you might have to if it's just like super hard clay. But hopefully we're planting during the rainy season when that soil has a little moisture in it. It might be a little easier to break up. Yes.
Our Hellstrip's about 100 feet long. With the half-inch irrigation, one source the entire time, or you have multiple sources?
That's a good question for the Urban Farmer. They are a wonderful resource for advice. I will say that the skinnier the tubing is, the lower the pressure. So that is another good reason not to use 1/4 inch or spaghetti tubing, but only the 1/2 inch diameter. Then you will have better water pressure. But I don't know if, what the limit of that is. So that's a very good question. Also, slope might have something to do with it too. So we don't have time to go over all the minutia, but I do want to move on to plants now. Yes.
I have a heavy invasion of weeds in the area that I'm looking to work. So once I remove all the weeds, I'm not going to use any type of sprays or herbicides or anything like that. What would I do? You said about using sheet mulching and compost. What type of layering would I do to avoid having the weeds returning again? Because I weed all the time and then I come back.
So that's a perfect opportunity for sheet mulching. So you cut down the weeds as low as you can, and then you put double cardboard, 4 inches of mulch, and then if you're planting 4-inch plants, all you have to do is plant them in, I'm sorry, when I said 4 inches of mulch, I meant 4 inches of compost. You plant directly in the compost. You don't have to cut a hole in the cardboard. And I would lay my irrigation on top of the compost and cardboard. And then you put mulch on top of that to keep the compost from blowing away, to protect the roots of the plants, to hide the irrigation tubing. Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of how that goes. If you are planting anything bigger than a 4-inch, you may have to cut a hole in the cardboard for it. But I would recommend that you don't do that if you can get away with it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about plants. Obviously, in our climate where we don't get a lot of cold and frost, the first thing that comes to mind is succulents, right? Succulents would appear to be a no-brainer for sidewalk landscapes because they're drought tolerant, they're tough, they're easy to propagate. So as they grow, you can take cuttings and fill in blank spots in your garden. But then the flip side of that is they're easy to steal. And I have literally, I haven't seen it, but my neighbor was an early riser. His window's right above the street. A truck pulls up and they start cutting my aeoniums. And he yells out the window, "Hey, 3 is enough, move on." And they did. But I mean, it's crazy making. The other thing is that succulents are fragile. So they do break easily. If it's an area where there might be some foot traffic, they're likely to break. And now, I'm not saying don't plant succulents. I'm just saying be aware. So the other thing to think about too is the thickness of the leaves. So succulents survive drought by storing water in their leaves. And so some of those little leaf succulents like sedums that have such small leaves, I find that they aren't as drought tolerant as advertised because they just can't hold on to enough water. Or something like this Echeveria is going to hold on to the water. Aeoniums are really tough. People do like to steal the colored Aeonium. But something like the Jack Caitlin usually is boring enough. And the Jack Caitlins are also pretty sun and heat tolerant. But if you're in a high theft area, just get boring plants, which unfortunately means you may not get them at Annie's because she doesn't really sell too many boring plants. But things like green Aeoniums, spider plants are great for the shade. If you've got a dark corner, I put spider plants down. They just do fine. Really super basic plants. I would also be very aware about anything that has thorns. Okay, now this looks like it has thorns, but it's actually quite soft. This is a Mangave lavender lady. It's a hybrid, very lovely. And it looks spiny, so it might deter people from touching it, but it actually isn't. On the other hand, here we have an aloe, and these are real spines. So I wouldn't plant anything spiny, partly for the liability, like you say, and partly for your own comfort if you're working or whoever you have doing the work in the garden. I borrowed some plants from a client who was throwing them out, and they turned out to be very spiny, and I can never take them out now. But fortunately, it's up against the building, so it's a little, it's not a problem for people walking. Other plants that are like succulents would be yuccas. So this is a nice yucca filamentosa color guard. And then here's a simple yucca rostrata. These are desert plants, so they can be really super tolerant. And they aren't succulents. So they're a little bit less fragile and hopefully less stealable as well. So though important to look at that, yes. We don't want to put super tall plants in. So the one thing I do like about Annie's website is there's these full descriptions on the website. So if there isn't a description in the, out there in the racks, then just look it up online. But I'm glad you asked. I wouldn't put anything in unless it's a street tree and you have a permit to plant a street tree, probably nothing bigger than 3 feet high, and consider width as well. So plants grow in the round. A lot of times people are like, well, what can I plant in that corner to block my neighbor? And it's like, you don't have any room there, and your neighbor's building is, 6 stories tall, and anything that gets that tall is going to be wide. So just be aware that plants grow in the round. And so that's why I say plant one every 1 to 3 square feet, because I'm assuming that they're not going to spread much wider than 3 feet either. But there could be some exceptions to that.
One of the problems we have our neighborhood, our neighborhood in Richmond Annex is amazing because people are out walking, and people are out walking their dogs. But the problem is that they're letting the dogs pee on the Hellstrip, or if you plant in front of your house too close to the sidewalk, the same thing. So I don't know if there's really nothing you can do about it. The wrought iron fencing is 18 inches high, and it does kind of deter little dogs. It's really about people. The dogs are innocent. Oh, absolutely.
They don't know any better. But sometimes if you have something that obviously looks very cultivated and pretty, that may help. Yes, you have a...
I was going to ask a similar question about cat scat, specifically stray cats.
Oh.
So there is no leash.
Okay.
Are there any plants that they hate the smell of that they would that would keep them at bay?
Interesting question. I do use a product called Critter Ritter, which is basically just a spray made out of black and red pepper. and it's supposed to last every 30 days. I don't know if it really does, but you know, there's a sidewalk landscape in front of my building that I've been maintaining for years, and I spray it down there every month or so. I think it helps a little, but in terms of does it deter, part of it is the cats are smelling the other cats, right? Or the dogs are smelling the other dogs, and they want to leave their mark too. So the pepper spray kind of obscures all smells. So they're like, oh, I can't smell anything. I don't know what's going on here. So they might be less tempted then. But in terms of what would they absolutely not want, you know, would the smell deter them by the plant? I don't know. So, but you might consider using a pepper spray. I use the pepper spray sometimes on irrigation tubing too, because, you know, sometimes when there's a new source of water, critters might decide they want to nibble on the tubing. And mice in particular, if they nibble, they leave such tiny holes that it's hard to repair, and you have to cut out a section of the tubing and put a new one in. But often, you know, once it's been running for a little while, they get used to it, and they don't feel like they need to come right to it. But yeah, so Critter Ritter, that might be a good start to get things established. And then once things are, you know, established, then they can survive a little bit of pee or poop. But at first, we want to kind of keep people out. You know, signs for the humans, right?
Yeah, but the problem is, you know how humans are. Many of the humans are.
They're on the phone. I know. Or get a nosy neighbor who can't sleep to look out the window and yell at them. That's what seemed to work for me. Yes.
As we've been choosing plants for our hellscape, this is a new category to me, so I'm not always familiar, like which of the succulents are considered valuable or which of the yuccas are considered valuable. How is there a website or somewhere I can go? I know Annie's has rare and unusual, so I'll stay away from those. But like we were up here last week, and we had a tray full of plants, and one of the attendants, the helpers here, said, "Oh, those are all considered valuable, and they'll get stolen." And I was like, "Oh wow, thank you so much for telling me." So.
Well, yeah, so I would say plants that are easy to find, like jade plants, you know, or, you know, green aeoniums, nothing that looks, that is a different color. Like, you know, a green yucca is probably going to be a little less desirable than a colored yucca. But I will say that, you know, when it comes to stealing, you know, you can't always predict what they will steal, because they were stealing the green aeoniums too. But the good news about green aeoniums, they're easily propagated. You can cut some more of them. You know, jade plants, same thing. You know, you can make 1 million jade plants. So it's going to be a little bit of trial and error. But basically, if everyone on the block has it, it's going to be less valuable. And that's a good option when you're deciding on plants too, is somebody else has a Hellstrip or similar conditions to a Hellstrip, that's the same side of the street, same wind exposure, same sun exposure, take note of what's growing there. And if it's doing well, then, you know, don't try to be like, you know, revolutionary when it comes to, especially if it's a high theft area. Like, just, it's better to have boring green than like you keep losing plants, essentially. A couple other things that, you know, obviously our natives will do well, but they do need to be established. So consider that all plants are high water use plants when we first put them in. So we can, you know, plant as small as possible. We can plant at the beginning of the rainy season, and we just need to water them at first. So our ceanothus, a couple different kinds of those. I have also found, let's see, that pelargoniums can be tough. And these are not natives, but this is one of my favorite, Veronica Contreras, and I've never been able to find it anywhere else. It's called Veronica Contreras. Oh, pelargonium. So these are what we think of as geraniums, right? The Martha Washington. They all have similar characteristics, which is sort of the leaves are tough and somewhat hairy, and that is a sign of drought-tolerant plants. So I have a roof garden, which is just a bunch of pots, no irrigation, constant exposure. Yes, it's in San Francisco, but it's wind, it's UV radiation, and I have to carry a watering can up to the top of the roof, so they don't get much water. So it's mostly succulents, but this pelargonium did pretty well for a while. Okay. And when I say for a while, that brings me to one last point, which is do have a budget for replacing plants that fail to thrive or are stolen or damaged, or just, poop out after a while, because we are growing in a hell strip after all. Again, plants that you can propagate easily, donated aeoniums and jade plants are going to work. Spider plants, if it's deep shade, they do pretty well. Yes? It's a house plant. So you remember in the 70s, everybody had their macrame plant holder, and they had this striped plant that made little spiders. Well, in a mild climate, they can grow outside, and they can actually throw their little spiders down on the ground and colonize. And they spread. And if you, especially like a dry shade situation, they really excel at that. Intense heat and cold, they're probably not going to do as well. But in our coastal influence climate, they can solve some problems. And they're certainly boring enough where people are unlikely to steal them. Yes?
Can you talk a little about trees?
Trees, yes. So often municipalities are going to have a permit process for planting trees. They may not have a permit process for the Hellstrip Garden. So I would recommend that you consult your local municipality and find out what are the requirements, and they will often have species recommendations as well.
And there are organizations that give trees, will plant them and give them away free.
But do be aware that trees need a lot of water to get started. So you will either need drip irrigation or a watering bag, which is just something you fill up and it drips out slowly.
And then, because you were talking about the system of having the sheet mulch and then compost the mulch, but that only being about 4 to 6 inches deep. So if I'm digging a bigger hole for a tree,
you cut a hole in your cardboard. You can still sheet mulch, but you have to cut a hole in the cardboard. So
I don't need to do that process repeat all the way down, or just
no
around where the hole.
So I would do the sheet mulch in its entirety, and then wherever I'm planting 4-inch plants, I just plant on top of the cardboard in the compost. Where I'm doing a larger plant, I would brush away the compost and cut a hole in the concrete for the larger plant.
Okay.
Yeah, and then put that sheet mulch back around the tree.
You said 2 layers of sheet mulch, right?
2 layers of cardboard plus 4 inches of compost, or if you're paving, you can pave directly on top of that, decomposed granite, something like that. So you can have your living and non-living parts of the garden all on top of the sheet mulch. All right, where are we at in time? 11:59. Wow.
That's pretty good.
So I have handouts.
Great.
Take one and pass it down. And thank you for returning my visual aids. I'll be here for questions for a little bit, so thanks all for listening and happy gardening.
Thank you.